Hi everyone, in this video I'll be summarizing and analyzing the contents of this book, The Origins and History of Consciousness, written by Erich Neumann. So it's a really impressive and thought-provoking book, but I must say also quite a difficult book to read. It's impressive to such a degree that even Carl Jung, who inspired Neumann to write this book, wrote that he actually wished he would have written this book himself. So I think that means quite a lot. And hopefully at the end of this video you'll understand why this is the case. So, as Neumann explained, the origins and history of consciousness is an attempt to create an outline of the archetypal stages present in the development of consciousness. So in this sense, the book is an attempt to explore the psychic, internal factors which direct the development of consciousness, as opposed to the external environmental factors. So for this exploration, Neumann observed that the archetypes developed by Carl Jung are crucial. So I've made a separate video of the archetypes, which you can see somewhere on your screen right now as well. But I think for now, Neumann's definition will be sufficient as well. The archetypes essentially being images which reveal the content of the unconscious. So Neumann wrote, "The structural elements of the collective unconscious are named by Jung archetypes or primordial images. They are the pictorial forms of the instincts. For the unconscious reveals itself to the conscious mind in images which, as in dreams and fantasies, initiate the process of conscious reaction and assimilation." So Neumann argued that human consciousness developed through various successive archetypal stages. And interestingly, these stages through which consciousness developed throughout human history are still the same stages through which each individual's consciousness must still develop currently. Neumann wrote, "The individual has in his own life to follow the road that humanity has trod before him, leaving traces of its journey in the archetypal sequence of the mythological images we are now about to examine." So in this sense, an understanding of the development of consciousness throughout history will also provide one with an understanding of one's own development of consciousness since one was born. So this development begins with a stage when the ego is still a part of the unconscious and is in this sense still trapped, until in the final stage the ego has become conscious to such degree that it can defend its own position, and they can actually prevent all of these unconscious forces from swallowing the ego up again. And as you will see, the development of consciousness can be characterized by a continuous battle between the conscious ego and the unconscious forces of ego. And as you will see as well, this battle is far from over. So in the first stage of the development of consciousness, the uroboric stage, the psyche and the outside world, they are one. So as Neumann argued, in this stage there is nothing with the capability to reflect, to differentiate itself from the outside world. So in this sense, Neumann indicated that history is in itself only a recent concept, since without the reflective capabilities of the ego, there can also be no history. So this does, however, not mean that early man did not produce anything from the psyche, or was not in a sense questioning his or her existence. As Neumann illustrated, early man developed many myths and rituals which, however, were not consciously developed. Instead, they were a product of the collective unconscious. So these myths and rituals, they provided answers to questions which were not asked consciously. As Neumann wrote, "These are the answers of what he calls the human soul and the human mind to questions which were very much alive for him, even though no ego consciousness had consciously asked them." So this stage is symbolized by the uroboric, which is the snake eating its own tail. And although the ego already exists in this stage, according to Neumann, it is still swimming around in circles. It's still a part of the round circle, and it has not been able to detach itself from this circle, in which all direction towards consciousness is swallowed up again by the whole. As Neumann wrote, "The world is experienced as all-embracing, and in it man experiences himself as a self, sporadically and momentarily only. Just as the infantile ego, living this phase over again, feebly developed, easily tired, emerges like an island out of the ocean of the unconscious for occasional moments only, and then sinks back again, so early man experiences the world. Man in this stage remains therefore unconscious for most of the time, guided by his instincts and under the guidance of great Mother Nature." Similar to Rousseau, Neumann speaks rather positive of this stage, indicating that Mother Nature here is a great nourisher and comforter, providing safety, pleasure, warmth, and forgiveness. All needs effortlessly supplied by the great nourisher. Such is that early state. Once removed from this uroboric state, Neumann observed that this positive side of great Mother Nature would not return until much later in the development of consciousness, until she reveals herself as Sophia, the gracious mother, outpouring forth her riches in the creative fullness of true productivity, as the mother of all living. So one may therefore wonder why early men even wanted to move on to the next stage of the development of consciousness, particularly since Neumann observed that within man there's always this strong tendency and this strong desire to remain in this unconscious state. However, Neumann observed that within man there is as well a certain counterforce which can be found in a strong desire to become conscious, which is a sort of instinct moving man in this direction. And within nature, Neumann argued that this tendency to become conscious is really unnatural and it's only specific to men, for whom this is a normal tendency, a tendency which differentiates man from nature around him. Neumann wrote, "The struggle between the specifically human and the universally natural constitutes the history of man's conscious development. It may take a long time for this tendency to develop towards consciousness has become more powerful than the natural tendency to slip back into the unconscious." Neumann wrote, "So long as the infantile ego consciousness is weak and feels the strain of its own existence as heavy and oppressive, while drowsiness and sleep are felt as delicious pleasure, it has not yet discovered its own reality and differentness. So long as this continues, the Ouroboros reigns on as the great whirling wheel of life, where everything, not yet individual, is submerged in the union of opposites, passing away and willing to pass away." Neumann symbolically called this phase uroboric incest. This incest with great modern nature is characterized by a desire to be dissolved and absorbed. Passively, one lets oneself be taken, sinks into the pleroma. Eventually this will lead to a final absorption by modern nature. Still, however, the infantile ego does not see this dissolution as a threat. This, however, all changes in the next stage of the development of consciousness, the stage of the Great Mother. Neumann indicated that this next stage is reached when the uroboric embrace has reached a point where it hinders the natural tendency of an individual to develop its consciousness. Here the uroboric embrace comes to be seen as a negative, threatening aspect. Neumann wrote, "It is, however, the same figure whose clinging embrace prevents the neurotic from being born into life. Then it is no longer the primordial figure of the Ouroboros, but in this case of a more developed ego, the indication that a further stage has been reached, namely the dominance of the Ouroboros over the ego, the stage of the Great Mother. In this next stage, Neumann observed that the ego must develop a new connection with the world. Within each new phase, the archetypes, myths, and symbols they change as well." Neumann wrote, "The individual's view of the world changes with every stage of his development, and the variation of archetypes and symbols, gods and myths, is the expression but also the instrument of this change. In the stage of the Great Mother, the ego becomes detached from the Ouroboros, and instead of being content with being a part of the self-whirling wheel of Ouroboric nature, the ego becomes aware of its own vulnerability and wants to cling on to the embryotic stage of consciousness it has now reached." Neumann wrote, "The unconscious life of nature, which is also the life of the Ouroboros, combines the most meaningless destruction with the supreme meaningfulness of instinctive creation. For the meaningful unity of the organism is as natural as the cancer which devours it. The ego is a defenseless entity in the face of this vast, all-absorbing power. It has always been like this, but now the ego has become aware of its position, something which it can never unlearn and must actually learn to accept, something with which new gods, rituals, myths, and archetypes may help. As a result, the embryotic infantile form of consciousness, although continually aware of its ties with the Ouroboриc matrix, slowly begins to form a system of its own. Out of consciousness, self-consciousness with an ego capable to reflect on itself comes forth. Once the ego truly experiences itself as an entity distinct from the Ouroboros, a truly independent conscious system can be formed. According to Neumann, self-reflection is an essential part of this stage. As with Narcissus, however, self-reflection may also have devastating effects if this phase persists. Resulting from this increased self-reflection, self-consciousness, and the strengthening of masculinity, the attitude towards the feminine, characterized by the Great Mother, also shifts. As Neumann indicated, these developments, they relegate the image of the Great Mother into the background. It is split up by the patriarchal societies and religions of the West, so the good aspects they are made conscious, whereas the negative aspects of the Great Mother, they have been immersed into the unconscious. And these unconscious evil aspects, they may then be projected upon the world. However, as a result, the masculine ego consciousness has now become strong enough to detach itself from the feminine uroboric. Neumann wrote, "The masculine principle is now strong enough to have reached consciousness of itself. Ego consciousness is no longer the satellite son of the maternal uroboric, chained to the almighty unconscious, but has become truly independent and capable of standing alone." And hereafter, Neumann observed that the next stage in the evolution of consciousness has been reached, the principle of opposites and the separation of the world parents. So Neumann indicated that in many myths, the sky and earth are believed to initially be one. Eventually, however, due to the actions of a god, sky and earth, they are split from each other. This, according to Neumann, represents the separation of the world parents, the creation of opposites. As Neumann further elaborated, only after man has become conscious, he can begin to discriminate. He wrote, "This act of cognition, of conscious discrimination, sunders the world into opposites, for experience of the world is only possible through opposites." As such, Neumann believed this to be the following stage in the evolution of consciousness. So in this phase, the identification of the individual with the ego grows substantially. Neumann wrote, "I am I, the fundamental statement of consciousness, is in reality a tremendous achievement. This act whereby an ego is posited and the personality identified with that ego, however fallacious that identification may later prove to be, alone creates the possibility of a self-orienting consciousness." So the separation of the world parents is a crucial aspect for this further self-identification with the ego, according to Neumann, since it is only at this stage that a serious differentiation between the ego and the world around him is established. Everything, man, animals, things, existed in the fluid, undivided state of uroboric unconsciousness. And dreams, according to Neumann, they still remind us of this stage. Neumann here also noted that the initial acts upon which the creation of an ego and the emergence of consciousness are built, they are mostly negative. He wrote, "To discriminate, to distinguish, to mark off, to isolate oneself from the surrounding context, these are the basic acts of consciousness." So this is in stark contrast to the unconscious, which is essentially a wave which wipes out all differentiation and isolation. Instead of differentiating, it combines. Neumann wrote, "The tendency of the unconscious is to combine and melt down, to say to everything, dat tvam asi, that art thou." So the reply of the conscious ego towards this statement would then be, at this stage, "I am not that." At this stage, however, Neumann observed that the ego is still quite insecure. The ego will only become really secure after successfully completing the next stage, the fight with the dragon. Until this has been accomplished, the uroboric unconscious, represented by the world parents and the terrible mother, are making significant efforts to prevent the emancipation of ego consciousness. So in this sense, the negative attitude of the ego towards the unconscious is in a way necessary, because this negative attitude, this struggle, can be seen mythologically as the fight with the dragon. In this stage, Neumann observed that the higher ego will emerge and the buried treasure will be raised, which represents knowledge. As already indicated, the uroboric unconscious is a feminine aspect, whereas the ego is a masculine aspect. And as a result, Neumann observed that at the stage of the separation of the world parents, represented by the creation of the principles and of opposites, and thereby the creation of the independence of ego consciousness, can also be seen as a stage of increased masculinity. And this also results, according to Neumann, in the creation of taboos and morality, the creation of good and evil. Neumann wrote, "The strengthening of consciousness is borne out by laying down taboos and of moral attitudes which delimit the conscious from unconscious by substituting knowing action for unwitting impulse." And this dominance of the masculine over the feminine and consciousness over the unconscious would have serious everlasting cultural implications, according to Neumann. So witch hunts, they are an example of the masculine conscious feeling threatened by the feminine unconscious. However, without this masculinization of the ego, consciousness would, according to Neumann, not have been able to free itself from the unconscious. And Carl Jung, he made a similar argument. He wrote, "The resistance of the conscious mind to the unconscious and to the depreciation of the latter were historical necessities in the development of the human psyche, for otherwise the conscious mind would never have been able to differentiate itself at all." As a side note, however, as Jung indicated here as well, our modern consciousness has pretty much gone too far in the depreciation of the unavoidable facts of the unconscious. So after the further differentiation of the conscious mind, the next stage, which is represented by the hero's journey, could commence. And in this phase, the unconscious forces may, after overcoming them, once again be integrated. Through the masculinization and the emancipation of ego consciousness, the ego becomes the hero. The story of the hero, as set forth in myths, is the history of the self-emancipation of the ego, struggling to free itself from the power of the unconscious and to hold its own against overwhelming odds. So as Neumann observed, upon reaching the stage of the birth of the hero, a radical shift has occurred. This can be seen clearly in mythology, where first the main feature of myths was its cosmic, universal quality. Now the myth's focal point has become the world at the center, with man standing upon it. This means in terms of stadial development, not only the man's ego consciousness has achieved independence, but that his total personality has detached itself from the natural context of the surrounding world and the unconscious. So instead of being represented by symbols, with the hero myth we enter a stage where mythology and symbolism become humanized. The hero here becomes the archetypal human symbol of the faith all humanity must live. However short of the ideal man they have fallen, the stages of the hero myth have become constituent elements in the personal development of every individual. So in this sense, the hero myth represents a collective transpersonal event which transcends the individual hero. Although they appear as inner events, the victory and transformation of the hero are valid for all mankind. They are held up for our contemplation, to be lived out in our own lives, or at least re-experienced by us. The hero represents the archetype for the mature ego, which is fighting to finally free itself from the continuous flow of unconscious forces. However, perhaps paradoxically, through the hero's journey, represented by the fight with the dragon, sleeping images of the unconscious may come to the surface from the center of the soul. So this time, however, they do not force the ego back into the unconscious. Instead, the ego learns to integrate these unconscious forces and benefit from them. And Neumann believed that all cultures, science and religion come forth from this creative center of the soul. He wrote, "The self-generating power of the soul is man's true and final secret, by virtue of which he is made in the likeness of God, the Creator, and distinguished from all other living things. These images, ideas, values, and potentialities of the treasure hidden in the unconscious are brought to birth and realized by the hero in his various guises: savior and man of action, seer and sage, founder and artist, invent and discover, scientist and leader." So all of this culminates in the phase where the constant cosmic interplay between consciousness and unconsciousness shifts the attention from the ego to the self. And Jung, he called this the individuation process, where consciousness and unconsciousness are once again united. However, this time, consciousness is actually powerful enough to stand its ground against the all-devouring unconscious. As a result, it does also not see the need to fight against it constantly, but is capable to open its doors to the wisdom and the images of the unconscious. But now there comes a new development. As through a Copernican revolution had taken place within the psyche, consciousness faces inward and becomes aware of the self, about which the ego revolves in a perpetual paradox of identity and non-identity. The psychological process of assimilating the unconscious into our present-day consciousness begins at this point, and the consequent shifting of the center of gravity from the ego to the self symbolizes the latest stage in the evolution of human consciousness. So Neumann, he believed that the unconscious uroboric state is a natural state for mankind. However, only relatively recently in human history, another tendency, which so far can only be seen in humans, developed in opposition to the unconscious state. Man slowly started to become conscious. This development was only possible through the development of a stable ego identity, according to Neumann. And Neumann argued that this development passed through several stages. And these stages, they can still be observed, according to Neumann, in every newborn individual. So consciousness developed in strong relation and also strong opposition to the unconscious. Neumann, however, also observed that the development of the conscious organ is still in its early days and is therefore still unstable. So in this sense, Neumann argued that consciousness is only a temporary release from the constant pull of the unconscious. The pull exerted by the great mass of the unconscious, i.e. by the collective unconscious with its powerful energy charge, can only become overcome temporarily by a special performance on the part of the conscious system. So hopefully after watching this video, you'll understand why even Carl Jung was so impressed by Erich Neumann's book, The Origins and History of Consciousness. I think the book is full of interesting ideas and I have definitely not been able to cover all of them in this video. So if you've read the book as well, please let me know in the comments what you thought about it and which ideas I may have missed or may have misinterpreted in this video. And if you like this kind of videos, then also please consider subscribing to this YouTube channel. So thank you for watching.